are watching Canadian Muslim News on Muslim Network TV. From Toronto, Ontario, I'm Catherine Bullock. Assalamu alaikum and greetings of peace. Today we'll be talking with Dr. Amer Shalaby, who is a professor of transportation engineering at the University of Toronto, about the future of public transit. But first, some news headlines. Trudeau reveals new cabinet after major shuffle. Government needs to decide by Friday whether to pay billions of dollars in compensation to Indigenous children. Sentencing trial begins for paramedics found guilty for death of Muslim teen in 2017. US Border Patrol officers fired for misogynistic online posts. And US, UK and Norway condemn Sudan coup. And now some details. Prime Minister Justin Trudeau has announced major changes to his cabinet today. Harjit Sajjan has been moved from Minister of Defence to Minister of International Development. Replacing him is Oakville MP Anita Anand. Anand is the second woman in the position of Defence Minister since Kim Campbell in the 90s. MP Omar Al-Ghabra will remain in his position as Transport Minister. Waterloo MP Bardish Chadha has been removed from cabinet. Chadha was the minister who streamlined the effort to hold a federal Islamophobia summit following the London attack in June. The federal government must decide by Friday whether or not to appeal a Canadian Human Rights Tribunal order. The order requires the government to provide billions of dollars in compensation for Indigenous children. Indigenous leaders and organizations have been critical of the government and their acts of reconciliation thus far. After the discovery of mass graves of Indigenous children in May, Indigenous communities have widened their calls for reconciliation and taking legal action. In an interview with the Globe and Mail, former chair of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, Murray Sinclair, says that the government should not overturn the tribunals. The sentencing for paramedics Stephen Snively and Christopher Marchant began Monday. Snively and Marchant were found guilty in June for delaying their help to Yosef Al-Hasnawi. Al-Hasnawi was shot outside a Hamilton mosque in 2017 while aiding an older man. They made multiple mistakes in responding to the emergency. Most dangerously, the paramedics disobeyed protocol for gunshot wounds. This ultimately resulted in Al-Hasnawi's death. With the maximum possible sentence resting at 5 years, the prosecution is fighting for a 2.5-year sentence. The defense seeks a sentence of less than a year with probation and community service provisions. 2 patrol officers from Texas and California have been fired following their posts on an online group. The Facebook group named I'm 1015 contains derogatory posts about women, migrants, and policymakers. The fired officers had posted images of former and current presidents of the United States raping women in Congress. In 2019, numerous complaints were made to the Customs and Border Protection Office. After investigating 135 complaints, 2 officers were fired, some were suspended, while others faced disciplinary action. In a statement by Homeland Security Secretary Alejandro Mayorkas, the Customs and Border Patrol say that they will not tolerate hateful, misogynist, or racist behavior. The governments of the US, UK, and Norway condemned on Tuesday the dissolution of the transitional government in Sudan and the declaration of a national state of emergency, as well as the detention of the country's prime minister. They also called on the security forces to immediately release those they have unlawfully detained. On Monday, General Abdel Fattah al-Burhan, the head of Sudan's Sovereign Council, announced the dissolution of the transitional government and the council and declared a national state of emergency. He said the military needed to protect the country's safety and security as stated in the constitutional declaration. As of now, there's been no response from the Canadian government. That's it for the news. And now a conversation with Dr. Amer Shalaby about the future of public transit in Canada. Welcome to the show, Dr. Amer. Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Thank you for having me.
Oh, it's our pleasure. Now, during COVID, a lot of people were able to work from home. They stopped taking the transit. Apparently, car purchases went up. How did COVID affect the public transit system?
Well, it affected it quite immensely. Ridership has gone down in most transit systems by up to 90% of their pre-COVID levels, which obviously also reduced the revenue stream. So this obviously created a lot of financial strain on public transit systems.
And apparently more people were buying cars.
That's true. More people were buying cars, more people were moving out from compact areas where public transit is quite effective and moving to areas where public transit is not really that competitive with the car. So those are significant trends that definitely will really have long-lasting impacts on public transit.
Obviously, people who are trying to get the emissions down aren't happy with this move back to the car. So can you talk a little bit about the long-term impact then on, I mean, you've just mentioned many things. There's budgets, there's where you live, there's the pandemic. How is it all working together?
Yeah, well, for so long, governments and urban planners have been actually trying to work together to create an urban form that is really conducive to using public transit. So compact urban form where public transit can actually function effectively. So when the pandemic hit, as I said, a lot of people actually wanted more space, wanted to move away from crowded areas. So they left their downtown areas and areas that are very well served by public transit to the suburbs. That would obviously increase auto use, increase emissions, and other impacts, even more accidents and so on.
The Build Back Better phrase that has become a catchword since the government was re-elected, people are saying that it must include a focus on public transit, but they're also saying that it has to focus on the people who need public transit. So some people could afford to buy the car during COVID, but other people were not. They continued to use and need public transit. What does it matter, like, to build back better? Why does that need a focus on public transit?
Well, public transit plays a major role in big cities in particular. Like, you cannot really imagine, for example, London or New York or Tokyo to function without effective public transit. And the same applies to Toronto, to a place like Toronto. So, and from an equity point of view, as you mentioned, rightly mentioned, that there's a lot of people who depend primarily on public transit for moving, for work and education and so on and so forth. Those people need to continue to really have a mode of transportation for their own well-being. So focusing on transit is essential. Is not an option not to. We have to really focus on public transit.
Do you mind just explaining that a little bit more for people who maybe they live in the suburbs, they never take the bus, they have no idea why it's important or relevant? How does it relate to equity?
Well, there's a lot of people who live in neighborhoods where obviously for whatever reasons, economic or otherwise, they cannot really have access to a car. So we as a society, we help each other to really fund a functional public transit system to serve everybody, but in particular those who really need it the most. And the city, for example, have defined a number of neighborhoods. They call them neighborhood improvement areas, which really receive higher priority in terms of provision of public transit, because those are areas where more racialized and lower income and households that have zero cars. So obviously people who live in those areas rely primarily on public transit.
Now, I've always thought it's a bit weird. The government wants and the cities want to encourage people to take public transit, but they keep raising the fare. Can you kind of just talk to that?
Yes. Well, public transit agencies like the TTC and My Way and Mississauga, for example, the only really leverage they have, but the only lever is really to increase fares if they want more revenues. So when ridership goes down, revenues go down. So those agencies, the only way to respond is to increase the fares in the absence of any subsidy from upper level governments. So if the provincial government, the federal government do not really provide sufficient subsidies, transit agencies, the only way to respond to lower revenues is to increase fares. And this, of course, results in the so-called downward spiral.
Yeah, it's the opposite. It'll have the opposite effect. You raise the fare, then less people are going to ride it.
Yeah.
So it has to come from subsidies. That's the only other option.
Yeah. So the way public transit actually functions is that no single transit agency in North America can actually can cover their operating expenses entirely from revenue, from fares. So they have to rely on some subsidy from the government. So in the case of public transit system in Toronto, TTC, they receive about 1/3 of their operating cost from the municipal government, from the city of Toronto. Which is really unfair, because other transit agencies in other places, they receive also funds from the provincial and the federal government.
I visited my uncle in Sydney once, and they have this wonderful system, not only of the buses and the trains, but also the ferries that go across the harbour.
Sure.
So I got up with him early one day and we took the ferry to work, and it was very reasonably priced. I can't remember, it's a long time ago. And he was saying that the subsidy is like a debt burden that's carried over the generations, so that, you know, it can be affordable.
Yeah.
In the contemporary era, is that kind of debt burden considered acceptable? Or we have this balance the budget kind of approach, which means that you can't have that kind of debt load carried forward?
Yeah. Well, as I said, public transit is almost an essential service for so many people. And even for us, for those who drive, if you do not really have an effective public transit, all those people will be using cars, and we very quickly highways will be clogged by traffic. So public transit is doing really has a major role in society. So definitely it cannot really recoup its operating expenses from the fare box. So some subsidy has to be provided. Up until the 90s, the provincial government was giving some subsidy, but then it downloaded this responsibility to the municipal governments, and they took charge of all healthcare expenses. So it was public transit was really badly damaged.
And do you think that the governments now have realized that, and in this post-pandemic era, they've made changes?
I think they've learned the lesson, because when that incident that I mentioned in the 90s, and the responsibility for subsidizing public transit was downloaded to the municipal government level, we lost a lot of ridership. And then revenues went down, fares went up, and that downward spiral happened before our eyes. Now we cannot afford to do the same thing. So there is recognition now that we need to really keep public transit service levels at an acceptable level, so that we do not really enter into this downward spiral.
What impact are self-driving cars going to have on this whole equation? Because suddenly they're saying that it's going to even revamp the whole design of cities. If we don't have people driving to work, you can just rent the car for a couple of hours. We're not going to need those massive parking lots. How is that going to affect public transit, do you think?
Yeah, I mean, in the absence of any coordination of or mitigation of the impacts of such technologies on public transit, there could be significant damage dealt to public transit. So, of course, there's a little bit of hype about really those technologies. They are not really expected to become mainstream before a decade or even two. Some pessimistic experts, they think it's not even before 20 years from now, when we can see those automated technologies. But definitely, if they are really let loose and they are not really, the effect on public transit is not mitigated, there could be significant impact.
Do you think we'll see self-driving buses too?
There are some trials around the world. Actually, there's going to be a trial here in Toronto starting next month on a small scale automated transit shuttle that runs between a neighborhood and a GO station in East Toronto. So those are all trials in very small, low density, low traffic contexts. So when actually do we expect to see those in bigger bus routes? That remains to be unknown at this point.
And all of that, of course, brings up the whole issue of work. What are you going to do with all the people who used to drive? Do the planners take those considerations into account?
Yeah, well, they're still going to be expected to have operators on board. So even with that shuttle trial that I mentioned, that's going to be rolled out next month, there's going to be an operator on board. And also in the future, operators will be expected to be on board as well for customer experience and customer questions and so on and so forth. Actually, there are a lot of automated subways around the world, and you have operators on board.
Well, public transit, I like to sleep while I'm on the bus or something, but it's definitely not a boring topic. We didn't even get to talk about the impact on health or climate emissions, but unfortunately we have to wrap it up. So thank you very much for your time, Dr. Amer.
My pleasure. Thank you very much, and thank you for having me.
That's it from us. You've been watching Canadian Muslim News on Muslim Network TV. Stay tuned for the next episode. Stay safe and God bless.